So I'm going to turn now to I suppose something like a second stage of this discussion, where the text is going to take us deeper into questions of ontology, because we have the problems before us, we know the kinds of solutions that are being offered, and to take us into ontology, the text is also going to take us to a backstory, the story before the matn. So I'm going to begin with this quote. This is another early commentary on the Sulam. This is by Muhammad al-Mubaraki, which I listed as number 1, and maybe the first commentary written on the Sulam completed, other than, of course, the self-commentary. So, in this one, the commentator Muhammad al-Mubaraki explains that the third position, right, that's the one that Matn focuses on. The first two are just silly and arbitrary, he says. So he says that the third position that is refuted by al-Bihārī, namely, just to remind you that the judgment applies to instances that are mentally supposed to exist. Mubaraki is telling you that this is a commitment to taking propositions to be non-definitive. And he writes the following. This is the quote from Muhammad al-Mubaraki. He says, he writes, propositions like this are called ghayr batti, and I translate that as non-definitive. And these are those propositions in which one passes the judgment that the extremes are unified, right? So A and B, or J and A, are unified in actuality on the determination that the nature of the subject tag, the unwan, is applicable to the underlying instances. So he's saying that this position that's being taken up is amounting to a commitment to understanding propositional semantics in a non-batti, non-definitive fashion. The Arabic is وَهِيَ الَّتِي يُحْكَمُ فِيهَا بِالِاتِّحَادِ بَيْنَ الطَّرَفَيْ. These are the two extremes. بَيْنَ طَرَفَيْهَا بِالْفِعْلِ عَلَى تَقْدِيرِ انطِبَاقِ طَبِيعَةِ الْعُنْوَانِ عَلَى الْأَفْرَادِ.
Could you just deal with the non-ghayr batti? I've not seen that term before.
Good.
Gloss a little bit on that?
I absolutely intend to, but it's going to come as a revelation.
Just waiting for it.
Yeah.
You're waiting for the download from the active intellect.
It's coming. Writing this book was also difficult because I'm not just trying to, present these technical arguments, right? I'm showing how the commentaries are getting to these arguments. So the process is important, and the process is coming through the history of the unfolding of and the isharat and the tadabbur and ta'ammal. So all of that is embedded here. So ghayr batti will show up. But if you're thinking, okay, where did this thing come from? That's exactly where I want you to be. Because all of a sudden this commentator throws this expression ghayr batti. It's not in the Sulam, but he's saying this is what the Sulam is doing. Okay, but outside of that expression, and where it comes from, he's simply giving a name to the way the proposition is being interpreted. He's saying this is a ghayr batti way of looking at propositions, and the point he's making here is that the J and A have an ittihad, they're unified, and it's on the taqdeer, on the posit or the determination of the tag applying to the underlying instances. That's what a ghayr batti means. In fact, to take up what you're saying, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first instances in the commentaries on this lemma of the Sulam where this third position that we've been discussing throughout in the past hour or 2 hours, where this third position is identified as a ghayr batti or non-definitive proposition. Al-Mubaraki further states that the following part of the lemma, by way of an example offered, namely that those who hold the third position interpret the proposition the participant with the creator as is impossible to be so on the basis of such mental determinations. And he says that this way of thinking of it is al-Bihāri's clarification of the non-definitive propositions. He says kama fassarahu biqawlihi. Right, so he's saying that there is some underlying notion of a ghayr batti proposition, and what Bihārī is doing in the third solution that he's offering is that he's actually doing a tafsir of ghayr batti propositions in trying to overcome this conundrum. Put simply then, the commentary supplies the third interpretive position with an explicit identity and asserts that the hypotext is itself offering an exegetical commentary on God knows what. Right? So he's in trying to solve the problem, Bihārī himself is engaged in some kind of tafsir of something called ghair batti, and that's what he's parsing and trying to plug into it as a solution. As we will see, this was the beginning of an unannounced textual excavation that came into sharp relief only in the efforts of later commentators. Al-Mubaraki does not tell us more about the living tradition to which the hypotext was implicitly responding, although he offers two more clues along the way. This is all about clues, right? He's sort of making you wonder and making you dig. Right? The first of these is found immediately preceding the part of the lemma where the Sullam offered its refutation of the third position. The commentator intimates that since the non-definitive proposition does not require the conceptualization of the thing about which the judgment is passed in reality, but only on the condition of the aforementioned mental determinations, the existence of the predicate for the subject does not necessitate existence of the latter in actuality either. So one more time. The commentator at this point is telling you that since the non-definitive proposition, because he's just giving a name, right? The ghair batti is the third refutation that's being offered. He says that since the non-definitive proposition does not require the conceptualization of the thing about which the judgment is passed, Sharik al-Bari, for example, it doesn't require a conceptualization of it, but only on the condition of the aforementioned mental determination. It's only on that condition, not the conceptualization of Sharik al-Bari, but on the condition of the mental determination of Sharik al-Bari. It's only on that condition that the existence of the predicate for the subject impossible for Sharik al-Bari, given that that's the case, it does not require the existence of the latter in actuality either. So the Arabic is فَلَا تَقْتَدِي ذَلِكَ الثُّبُوتِ الْمُثْبَتْ لَهُ بِالْفِعْلِ. Right? So the muthbat lahu, of course, is the subject term. So it's given that you have this kind of ghair batti reading, which is conditioned on certain hypotheses and suppositions, it does not require in reality the existence of the subject term. Rather, owing to the mental determinations, that for which something exists may itself be mentally determined. And since that which exists for the latter is dependent on it, it is a far' muthbat lahu, it may also be mentally determined. So again, he's bringing ghair batti is allowing you to put the subject and predicate on the same ontological plane because it's all happening on the posit of mental hypotheses and suppositions. And if the predicate is a far' or dependent on or derivative of that of which it is predicated, and if of that of which it is predicated is a hypothesized entity, then the predicate would be fine on the same ontological plane. And of course, he will go on, as we will see, to say this is also a way to think about it, fi nafs al-amr, right? Again, once you have a posit, you can do what you want with it in terms of its own givenness. So the upshot is that the non-definitive parsing of the proposition allows one to apply predicates to mentally determined instances on the condition of the application of the quiddity of the mentally supposed subject tag to those instances on the same ontological plane. And this predication on this condition, as well as the principle that that which exists for a thing is dependent on that for which it exists, is valid with respect to the way things are, fi nafs al-amr, that's what he says. And again, I hope that, I know I'm going to get pushback from colleagues about on this fi nafs al-amr business, but these are the reasons, these are the moments which compelled me to adopt it as with respect to the very given, right? Which becomes a spectrum concept, but it does the work in sort of a unified way, right? Because that which is the very given could be a mind-independent reality, it could be a mental supposition, it could be a mere tag or determination. Once it's posited or given as such, independently or dependently, then taking it in its givenness will allow certain predicates to apply to it by virtue of its very givenness.
What would be the pushback that you would receive for?
Oh, the examples I gave before, right? Because people, some of my colleagues whom I deeply respect, and it's a weird expression, translated the essentiality of a thing or the reality of a thing or the definition of a thing. They work in different parts of that spectrum, but I wanted some way of thinking about the expression that covers all of them, right? So it's something that can be moved along with the ontological space that you're operating on. So this is one sort of way of dealing with that expression. There's a very wonderful article by Hassan Pazioglu on this in Nazariyat. There is an article written by actually a student at LMU that I know of. In fact, I thought he was supposed to come, Abdurrahman Mehrig, I think. He has written a wonderful article on it. So, but there are debates about this, so I'm ready to. I was looking forward to seeing him. He would have jumped up just now, and we would have had a debate.
Can I ask you a question? So not translating it as a matter of fact or as a fact in and of itself, there's an issue with that because.
Oh, if you say because it implies that the fact has some reality before the posit, which it can, right? Nafs al-amr can also relate to facts in themselves, but you may concoct the fact, and then by virtue of that concoction, things will be true of that. Things will be true of that, of it in virtue of itself, right? So once I posit the square circle given as such, the square circle fi nafs al-amr would be impossible, and you can say that. Yeah. Okay. Are we okay? Should we move on?
So why don't you sort of tie it up the way you'd like, and then we'll open it up for
Great.
a broader discussion with the hour that we've got.
Sure. I don't know how long it'll take though, but I only have 2 more pages to read and 4 more quotations to go through. But given that we pause and I explain, should I proceed, or we're getting to pretty much the wrapping part actually.
Okay.
Should I go on? So let me give myself 10 minutes, is that okay? And whatever, as far as we get with that. Okay. And so, I think this part is done. Let me go back to the upshot as I was explaining it. The upshot is that the non-definitive parsing of the proposition allows one to apply predicates to mentally determined instances on the condition of the application of the quiddity of the mentally supposed subject tag to those instances on the same ontological plane, and this predication on this condition, as well as the principle that which exists for a thing is dependent on that for which it exists, is valid with respect to the way things are given. Fi nafs al-amr. This is so since that which is given is precisely the mentally determined ontological locus, not that which is given simpliciter, not mutlaqan. So now I'm going to look at quote number 10 here. It is for this reason, al-Mubaraki, that commentator, writes that the proposition is called non-definitive, غير بطي. And so what al-Bihārī states as a refutation of the third position is rejected. The reason is, why is he rejecting this explanation being given by Bihārī? The reason is that if by impossibility he intends a simple negation of existence that is merely emphasized by the assertion of impossibility, then since the simple negation of existence does not obtain for the quiddity with respect to the way things are given, fi nafs al-amr, simpliciter, then how can the simple negation that is emphasized obtain? And if he intends the negation of existence that is the predicate of the negative proposition, which is negative predicative proposition, this is the mahmul, salibat al-mahmul, then there is no doubt that in this case it also fails to obtain fi nafs al-amr with respect to the very way things are given, simpliciter. Rather, the negation and impossibility obtain with respect to the way things are given on the condition of the mental determination. In fact, they are mutahaqqaq fi nafs al-amr ala hadha al-taqdir. In other words, impossibility applies, so I'm just parsing this quotation, impossibility applies with respect to the way things are given on the posit of the mental determinations, otherwise it does not apply at all. Therefore, for the proposition to have the validity that is clearly granted by all sides, we all say sharik al-bari mumtane, for it to have that validity, in other words, for the participant with the creator is impossible to be true for all parties, it must be parsed as ghair batti, as non-definitive. And this latter interpretation is a vindication of the third position against the Sulam's claim. I will briefly return in a moment to comment on how this intervention of al-Mubaraki, especially with reference to the key principle, the principle number 2, that the ontological locus of a thing that exists is dependent on the ontological locus of that for which it exists, how this was a guiding clue for the later commentaries. As for the nature of his philosophical contribution, I don't think we'll have time to get to that. The second implicit hint that drove the commentarial choices in textual archaeology follows immediately after al-Bihāri's postured refutation of the third position. We are told by Mubaraki that the expression fatadabbar, that we have seen now a few times, with which the commentarial itinerary began, points to, there's an ishara, it points to the non-definitive readings of the proposition. We witnessed just now precisely how this interpretation undermined the matin's own refutation, and how, according to the commentator, the former's lemma was in fact an explication of and concession to this underlying sense of the proposition. We are now informed by al-Mubaraki that an appeal to any primary notions of what a proposition means as a way to overcome the challenge of the non-definitive reading is not admissible in debate, right? You can't just say this is not how we think of a proposition, because that's precisely what logic and philosophy does. It looks at different modes of looking at claims. So he says, وَدَعْوَى الْبَدِيهَ لَا يَكْفِي فِي مَحَلِّ النِّزَاعِ. Right? You can't just say that in a badihi fashion we don't think of it this way. That's not how we do philosophy. This comment, of course, relates back to Bihāri's idea that the parsing offered by the third position is not that to which the mind is led, that I've talked to you about before. Mubaraki then offers the following final extended commentary on the lemma of the Sulam. This is number 11. He says, one must know that non-definitive predicative propositions, although they may be equivalent to conditional propositions, thank you, do not reduce to them. So there's a debate going on about that, as it is imagined. For the judgment in them about that which is taken up is on the basis of a certain determination, namely, that the determination is owing to the completion of the mental supposition of the subject. This is such that there was no nature that had obtained positively at all, experimentally or mentally, before such supposition. The determination was not such that there was a subject that had already been supposed, and then it was supposed with respect to itself, and then a judgment was passed on it with a view to the aforementioned determination. In other words, it is not that the subject of the proposition is the type that is temporally restricted or qualified in some other way, such that the proposition would be conditional. It should be stressed that neither the expression al-batti nor any of its derivatives in a technical sense appear anywhere in the Sulam. Nor indeed does the lemma of the Sulam justify the commentator's slippage into the concern of disambiguating the predicative non-definitive propositions from conditional ones. The entire discursive thrust of al-Mubaraki, this commentator, from the parsing of the third proposition squarely in terms of non-definitive propositions to the connection of the ensuing proof with the principle that what exists is a derivative of that for which it exists, to attributing al-Bihāri's failed refutation to the nature of non-definitive propositions, to the reference to a dispute at which the counter-refutation hints, to the extended discussion about the difference between non-definitive and conditional propositions, all of this appears out of place. It's not in the Sulam. And this anomaly, of course, must have signaled something to future commentators. Because we're now out of time, and I've spoken for a very long time, the expression is coming from Mir Damad. And what's happening with Bihārī is that he's taking, I'm not going to read anymore, what's going on in Bihārī is that he's taking the underlying dialectic that immediately preceded his generation with Mir Damad, and some notions such as ghair bati, non-definitive propositions, Mir Damad's position on Ja'al Basit, simple generation that we can talk about. He's taking all of these ideas up into his logic, this ontology, and which is effectively also a theology, right? The incipience of the world, or the incipience of essences, not insofar as existence comes to supersede them or supervene on them, but insofar as their mere establishment is their very existence. Those ontological positions are being taken up by Bihārī in his very short matan, and the commentators are being led back to that dialectic and that debate along the way. The upshot of it is the following. Here's how the problem is solved, right? We know that something like the creator, the equivalent of the creator is impossible, is problematic for reasons that we violate two of the principles of propositional semantics. The final solution that's being offered hinges on two things. If you adopt an ontology of Ja'al Basit, meaning that the creator does create essences, but it's the establishment of the essences that is their existence, not the fact that an existence, not the idea that the non-existent is a thing of some sort, has an existence, and then existence comes to supervene on it. If you adopt that principle, and you also adopt a reading propositions as ghair batti propositions, then you can actually have your semantics work. Then you can make claims like the square circle is impossible and absurdity is something that cannot be conceptualized, and so on and so forth. As you saw, just to wrap this up, as you saw that we began with these two principles, certain problems in propositional semantics that are created by these two principles. Some of these problems are motivated by theological claims, and the solutions are ultimately being offered through a readjustment of ontology and a readjustment of the incipience of the world coming from Mir Damad. So this is how these different parts are working together. I wish I could spend more time sort of really spell it out for you, but you have the book, and I'll stop here then. Thank you so much.